Welcome to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and this is my Night Killer dagger from the solo leveling manhwa. Night Killer's the dagger that Jinwoo buys during the job advancement quest. It's the second dagger he gets, so it's the second one I'm making as part of my challenge to make all of the solo leveling daggers. Before I could model this, I needed a reference image to work off of. I thought I could just go in and skim the manhwa and look for these, but I ended up getting sucked in and spending hours rereading my favorite moments. Eventually, I did collect the images I needed. The next step was creating a reference image in Gimp. Despite showing up a lot and generally looking awesome, we don't get a great view of this dagger. I decided to base my design off of this image from chapter 44, which has a good view from the side. There's not a lot of detail here, but it gave me the general shape. I traced everything with red and black. I wasn't too concerned about the little details because I can tweak things in Blender. Like most solo leveling daggers, the Night Killer design is inconsistent. Even the number of teeth it has varies. That leads to a lot of great looking art, but means there isn't a perfect reference image to work off of. I'm happy with the design decisions I made, but if you compare this to the original art, it's easy to spot some small differences. Because the image I was using didn't show a lot of detail, I roughly outlined the details on the blade and the hilt based on other images. For the handle, I had a choice between doing this incredibly intricate design, which I think we see once or twice, or wrapping it in white fabric. I went with the fabric because it's more iconic and way easier. I went with a pretty simple design for the handle and the pommel because I wanted to work out those details in Blender. In Blender, my first attempt at making the blade did not go well. It was really tricky with these teeth, and I didn't have that much experience at this point. My next attempt was kind of better. I really screwed up the mesh at some point, but even rewatching the footage, I'm not exactly sure where I went wrong. I think I clicked on the wrong set of points when I was doing the extrusion, but who knows. I ended up having to fix a bunch of this mesh, but it was worth it in the end. I added the handle and the hilt, and then turned my attention to the detailing on the blade. Cutting in the grooves was a mess. There's probably a clever solution for this, but I didn't figure it out. I kept having to pause this recording so I could watch YouTube videos and try to figure something out. I didn't do the best job, but it turned out pretty well. I created the pommel in the same way as I created the blade. I started with a mesh and then extruded it up 1mm before extruding it again. I adjusted the second extrusion in to create the angled edge of the blade. Once I mirrored this, that 1mm extrusion I started with meant the blade had a 2mm flat edge, which makes 3D printing and finishing this way easier. I repaired the full dagger in Repetier host, which I use for checking all of my models. I imported the repaired dagger into Blender and then positioned a series of cubes overlapping it. By adding a Boolean intersect modifier to each of these cubes, they became perfect pieces of the dagger. Afterwards, I placed cylinders in between these pieces and used a Boolean difference to cut them in. These created perfect channels for bits of nails to go between these pieces, which helped align them during gluing and strengthen the joins so it's less likely to snap. Then I exported everything and I was ready for printing. I used 2-part epoxy to attach this together like usual, but unlike my normal process, I had to do this several times because the damn thing kept breaking. I wish I had a funny excuse, like I was trying out Ruler's authority and throwing this around, but I don't. The first time this broke was when I was about to sand it. One of these teeth hooked onto my dust mask, and when I picked up the mask, this plummeted to the floor and shattered. The second time, this slid off a table and shattered again. I think this happened a couple more times, but honestly I lost track. This prop just seemed to have a death wish. Eventually, I managed to keep this thing together long enough to sand it. I did some rough sanding with a Dremel tool, then applied some wood filler, and then did the final sanding by hand. Unfortunately, there was some damage to the blade which I couldn't completely sand off. To start off the painting, I used some spray-on sandable primer, and then moved on to airbrushing. The first airbrush coat I did was all wrong. I bought a set of TimberTech paint when I got my airbrush, and I really like it. It doesn't clog, it has good coverage, and it doesn't come off to the touch. It's great stuff, I just didn't have the right color for this. I ordered some Jacquard Red to try out the brand. It has good coverage, is generally okay to the touch, but it's way too thick. It worked well once I figured out how to thin it, but it was a pain. After several coats with the airbrush, I pulled out my normal brushes and started adding the details. I added gold to the hilt, these two pins, and the pommel. When I was airbrushing this, I was convinced that the pommel was the same color as the blade, which is how it is on most of the solo leveling daggers, but I was wrong, so I got to paint over that. I very carefully painted the blade black. Because I airbrushed on this red, I couldn't easily go back and touch it up. Everything went surprisingly well, and I didn't have any major screw-ups. I did a few rounds of spray on matte clear coat, and then hung this to dry overnight. Thankfully, I properly secured this prop so it didn't crash to the ground and get damaged. Normally I wouldn't have to brag about that, but I managed to mess this up on the 2 projects I posted last month. I wrapped the dagger handle with some white muslin I had lying around. I cut a 2-inch strip that was about a yard long, folded it over so I had nice edges, and then ironed it so it was nice, smooth, and stayed in place. Then I secured it with some glue, and that was it. I think this turned out really well, and if anyone watching this is debating what solo leveling dagger they want to 3D print, I'd recommend going for this one. It looks awesome, and it doesn't have that many intricate details you have to work around, unlike something like Rakasa's Fang, which I did last month. So far, as part of this challenge, I've made Rakasa's Fang and Nightkiller, so next month you can look forward to my remake of Baruka's Dagger. Both Baruka's Dagger and the Demon King's Dagger are 3D printed and waiting to be epoxied together, so stay tuned. I'll post links to the STLs in the video's description in case you want to make your own. If you enjoyed the video, then please give it a like so YouTube recommends this to more people. If you want to support the channel and see the rest of this series, then please subscribe.